It began when I was around 5 or 6 years old, which would place it sometime between 1988 and 1989. That was when I first started seeing what I later came to call the Bloody Man. He would walk slowly up and down the staircase in my house. I can't remember his face at all. I'm not sure whether that's because I never dared to look directly at it, or because there simply wasn't a face to remember. What I do recall clearly is that these sightings never happened in the middle of the night. They always occurred around bedtime. He wore a hospital gown, and his head was wrapped in a bandage soaked through with blood. Even at that young age, I had a strong sense that what I was seeing wasn't right. But oddly enough, I wasn't afraid. I don't know if the absence of fear came from being told somehow not to be scared, or if I was simply too young to understand what fear really was. Years later, I would learn the truth about who that figure was. The man I had been seeing was my uncle. He had been attacked and beaten in the head with a baseball bat. He managed to make it home afterward, went to sleep, and during the night his brain swelled. In the morning, my family rushed him to the hospital, but he passed away several days later. This all happened in August of 1982. I wasn't born until December of 1983. There is much more to his life story and to the events surrounding that night, but I'll leave those details aside for now. What matters here is that I saw the Bloody Man many times, somewhere between 15 and 30 encounters. Eventually, my mother and I moved out of that house and into our own place. The house had belonged to my grandfather. I was away from it for about 5 years. When I was around 12 or 13 years old, we moved back into that same house. I never saw the Bloody Man again after returning, but that didn't mean the paranormal experiences stopped, not even close. About 5 or 6 months after moving back, I was in my bedroom showing my little sister how to play a Sonic the Hedgehog video game. I was explaining the controls to her when, as clearly as if someone were standing right there, a woman's voice spoke my sister's name. My sister immediately stood up, walked to the door, and replied, "Yes, ma'am." I was completely frozen. There were 2 reasons for that. The first was that I knew with absolute certainty that the voice had not been my mother's. It belonged to my grandmother, who had been dead 10 years. The second reason was something my sister didn't seem to notice at all. The voice hadn't come from downstairs. It came from right at our feet, from the foot of the bed. I sat there, unable to move, while my sister called out to our mom. My mother answered from the kitchen, saying she had been washing dishes and never called for her. My sister returned to the room, clearly upset. "What's wrong?" I asked. She looked frustrated and said, "I hate those stupid stairs. The Bloody Man is scary." At that point, I started asking her questions. Who told her about the Bloody Man? Was it one of my friends? Someone at school? She became hysterical, shocked that I knew what she was talking about. She cried, begging me to believe her, insisting that no one had told her anything and that she truly saw him herself. She was about 5 years old at the time, the same age I had been when I first started seeing him. The next part of the story involved my friends. After the night we heard my grandmother's voice, something new started happening. Every time I had friends over for a sleepover, my bedroom door would begin to shake violently. At first, we assumed it was my stepfather messing with us. We would open the door while it was shaking, only to find no one standing there. The moment we realized no one was outside, the shaking would become absolutely terrifying.
For about a year, at nearly every sleepover, the door would rattle and horrible claw-like scratching sounds would scrape down the surface of it. My friends and I would scramble together, hiding in the corner of the bed while it happened. If you're keeping track, that makes me and my sister, who both saw the bloody man and heard the female voice, and 3 of my friends who experienced the shaking and scratching at the door. 5 people. But somehow, that still isn't the craziest part. About a year later, we sold the house and moved a couple of cities away. One detail I should explain is that the reason we moved back into the house when I was 12 was because my grandfather had suffered several mini strokes and was confined to a wheelchair. My mother moved back in to take care of him. After we moved away again, I once told my mom how surprised I was that she sold her childhood home. She explained that the bad memories had eventually replaced the good ones. Then she added something else. She said my grandfather had started to creep her out toward the end. He would tell her, "Your brother is still here, every night, up and down those goddamn stairs, up and down, up and down." He had been seeing the bloody man too, his own son. Years later, about 8 or 7 years after the house was sold, the man who bought it ran into my uncle at a gym. He immediately rushed up to him, demanding to know what the hell was in that house. The new owner, his wife, and 2 of their children had all been seeing my uncle inside the home. After hearing this, I made a point of walking by the house to try and talk to them. One day, I managed to speak with the youngest son. He told me he had been too young at the time to remember clearly, but that his parents and 2 older brothers frequently saw my uncle reflected behind them in mirrors throughout the house. Eventually, they removed the mirrors, and the sightings stopped. That part never happened to me. Mirrors had nothing to do with my experiences. But still, when you add it all together, the numbers speak for themselves. 3 people in my family, 3 friends, 4 people from an entirely different family, all seeing or hearing the same thing. And I would give anything to understand what truly happened in that house.
To give proper context, my school once received a government grant that allowed them to choose 25 students to take part in a special trip. We were sent to an abandoned village in Spain where we could miss 5 days of school. In exchange for our stay, we were required to do basic restoration work to help maintain the village. Our tasks included cleaning the streets, painting walls, helping out in the kitchen, and taking care of livestock. It was physically demanding work, but despite that, we had an incredible time. The village was called Granadilla, located in the province of Cáceres, for anyone curious enough to look it up. The program itself was known as the Program for the Recovery and Educational Use of Abandoned Villages. As for the history of the place, Granadilla sits along the edge of a reservoir that flooded the town during the 1960s. Many of the residents were forced to leave, but those who refused drowned. According to local accounts, the original cemetery still lies underwater to this day. On the first night, the counselors who lived in the village took us to the newer cemetery and began telling us frightening stories about the area. They spoke of ghosts, tragic lovers who took their own lives in the old castle, and other legends tied to the village. One of the counselors even hid behind the cemetery wall and would occasionally bang on it or make noises to scare us during the stories. Despite the intentional scares, it was obvious that everyone was enjoying themselves. Then, suddenly, we saw a car in the distance. Granadilla is an extremely isolated place. There are no street lights on the road, so the only things we could see were what our flashlights illuminated, and now the headlights of that car. I distinctly remember the looks the counselors exchanged when they noticed it. Granadilla is far from any other town. There are no shops or houses nearby, and nothing within roughly a 20-minute radius. That road leads only to the village, and everyone who should have been there already was. About 50 students total, including another school, 4 teachers, and 3 counselors from the village. So the question was simple. Who was driving down that road at midnight toward a place that leads nowhere? The car moved very slowly, almost creeping toward where we were standing. At first, we thought it might be part of a planned scare by the instructors, but the counselors were acting far too convincingly. None of them smiled or broke their composure. They looked genuinely confused as they watched the car approach. The vehicle stopped near us, turned around, and drove back the way it came, disappearing into the darkness. We laughed nervously, assuming it had just been a strange prank. A few minutes later, the car appeared again, but this time there was another one behind it. Both vehicles were completely identical, white, old-fashioned, boxy cars. They drove extremely slowly, tailgating one another as if they were part of a procession. I remember seeing one counselor gesture to another, silently asking if he knew who they were. Both shook their heads. The cars repeated the same behavior. They approached us, paused briefly, then turned around and left again. Some of the students began asking the teachers who the drivers might be, clearly growing uneasy. The counselor who had been hiding behind the cemetery wall stepped out as well, staring down the road where the cars had vanished. No one had any answers. Even the teachers began asking whether there were people known to wander around that area. Then, for the 3rd time, the cars returned. This time there were 3 of them, again completely identical. They moved slowly, one behind the other, but now, instead of turning away, they pulled into a small gravel area beside the cemetery, roughly 50 meters from where we stood. The engines shut off. All the doors opened at the exact same moment. That was when I truly became afraid. 3 figures stepped out of the cars. They were similar in height and build, and they simply stood there, facing us. I say they were staring at us because that's what it felt like. The truth is, I never managed to see their faces or make out any clear human features at all. At that point, my teacher began telling us to stand up and move. We followed the counselors back toward the village, while the teachers stayed behind us, watching carefully and urging everyone to stay calm. As we arrived back to Granadilla, the counselors closed the gate that led into the village and told us again to remain calm. The village is surrounded by walls, and there is only one entrance, which was now sealed shut. Whoever those people were, we were officially out of their reach. That night, many of my classmates were visibly shaken. Some cried as they lay next to their teachers, who tried to reassure them by saying it was surely just a prank, but no one truly believed that explanation. If it had been a joke, it was an incredibly cruel one. Despite that first night, we were able to enjoy the rest of the week without any further incidents or strange visitors. There were no buildings specifically constructed for students to sleep in, so we stayed in the former homes of the villagers. Houses with 2 rooms were emptied and converted into dormitories, each holding 12 beds, 6 in each room. We worked hard during the day and explored every corner of the village at night. We staged fake weddings, snuck out to stargaze, and even bothered the cattle after dark. It was exactly the kind of reckless fun you'd expect from 16-year-olds, given an entire village to themselves for a week.
By the time our final night arrived, we were completely exhausted. Some of us had barely slept all week due to the constant activity, and the physical labor during the day was starting to wear us down, both mentally and physically. After dinner that night, almost everyone went straight to bed. A few students stayed up chatting with kids from the other school, but by around 1 a.m. the entire village had gone quiet. Our room had a large window that we left open to let in fresh air, which meant we could usually hear anyone moving around outside. That night, however, there was absolute silence. I couldn't sleep. That happens to me often when I'm excited, and I'd had such a great experience that week, I was still replaying everything in my head. I'd almost forgotten about the car incident from the first night. Then I heard the downstairs door open. It was an old, heavy door, one that dragged loudly against the wooden floor. It was impossible to open quietly. I was confused because I hadn't heard anyone walk past our open window. I assumed it must have been one of the teachers checking to make sure everyone was asleep or trying to catch students sneaking around with their partners. But the strange thing was that they had never come into our house before. We were usually quiet and went to bed early out of sheer exhaustion. Whoever it was began climbing the stairs. Slowly. On the landing, there were 2 doors facing each other, ours and the room belonging to girls from the other school. The wood creaked beneath their feet as they climbed, moving so slowly that it felt unnatural. I lifted my head to see if any of my friends were awake. They were all asleep. The person reached the top of the stairs, paused briefly, then began walking toward our room. The door didn't fit properly in its frame, leaving a gap of about 5 centimeters at the bottom. Light spilled through the opening. I sat up, listening carefully. I looked toward the door and saw 2 feet standing directly against it, as if whoever was there was leaning their entire weight into the wood. The handle moved slightly, but the door didn't open, as if someone with very little strength was trying to turn it. I quietly unzipped my sleeping bag and sat on the edge of the bed, lifting my feet so they wouldn't touch the floor and make a sound. I glanced around the room again. Everyone was still asleep. The handle continued to move, barely perceptible. I was absolutely terrified. Then I stood up. The moment my foot touched the floor, the wood creaked, and whatever was outside reacted instantly. It shot down the stairs at an impossible speed. What terrified me most was how fast it moved. It didn't sound human. Each step it took hit the stairs with enormous force, as if it weighed hundreds of kilos, slamming its weight into the wood. It felt like it was running for its life. When it reached the floor below, it slammed the door so violently that the walls shook. I couldn't move. I stood there trembling, frozen in the same spot. The strangest part wasn't that someone might have entered the house. It could have been a student, a teacher, someone trying to scare us. The problem was that no human, child or adult, could move that fast.
In April of 2014, my friend Paul and I drove up to Loch Awe in Scotland for a weekend of fishing. We had known each other since primary school and had always been close, but as we got older, full-time jobs, marriages, kids, finding time to spend together became harder and harder. That shift really began around 2009 or 2010. It was also around that time that Paul first invited me to go fishing with him. I didn't even know he was into fishing back then. But after joining him that first time, I immediately understood why he loved it so much. Working 9 to 5 all week, coming home to the joyful chaos of raising young kids, it was rewarding but exhausting.
Back in my early 20s, the idea of sitting beside a river doing absolutely nothing sounded painfully boring. But later in life, when every day felt like either work chaos or home chaos, those quiet afternoons became pure relief. Fast forward about 4 years, and we were heading north to a private loch where we had permission to fish. A friend of a friend's father was a member, and we were told that if anyone asked, just mentioning his name would be enough. That permission mattered, especially because we planned to camp there for 2 nights. We weren't new to camping by then. We'd been on at least a dozen similar trips and had upgraded from bare-bones survival to comfort and convenience. We brought proper cooking gear, portable chargers, and a small speaker for music. That year, though, Paul brought something new. As soon as we finished setting up camp, he pulled out 2 small walkie-talkies sealed in a waterproof bag. They were fully charged, cheap but reliable, and supposedly had batteries that would last a full week. The idea was to save phone battery life since we were constantly playing music, watching videos, or messaging each other. The radios turned out to be more than useful. They were fun. Whenever one of us wandered off to collect firewood, check bait, or grab something from camp, we'd talk over the radios. We'd pretend to be military operators, hurling insults back and forth in mock seriousness. It became a running joke and something we used every time we were separated. That Saturday afternoon, both our lighters failed within half an hour of each other. We'd already had a couple of beers, so I volunteered to walk to the nearest small shop while Paul stayed behind to watch our gear. It was about 6 miles round trip. We kept in contact over the radios at first, but after about 2 miles, once I crested the hills, the signal faded. I reached the shop, bought several disposable lighters along with a few other items, and started the long walk back. For the first mile, the radio was silent. Once I crested the hills, I started picking up faint static. I tested it every minute or two, confused as to why I'd had better range on the way out than on the way back. Then the radio crackled. At first, I couldn't make out what was being said. I tried telling Paul that I couldn't hear him clearly, but it didn't seem like he could hear me either. I kept walking, leaving the radio on, waiting for his voice to come through properly. When it finally did, something was very wrong. There was a strange metallic whine at first, which I assumed was interference. I turned the radio off and back on again. When it came back, the sound was louder, clearer. It wasn't interference. It was Paul, and he was crying. Not loud, uncontrollable sobbing, but quiet, broken whimpers, short bursts of crying, as if he were holding down the transmit button just long enough for the sound to spill through. I immediately asked if he was okay. I assumed he'd received terrible news, something you only cry about when someone has died or something equally serious has happened. I kept asking what was wrong while walking faster. He didn't answer. I assumed he still couldn't hear me. Then he spoke. Through tears, he said, "I'm so sorry. Lydia." I stopped walking. I demanded to know what he was talking about, who Lydia was, what was happening. There was no response. He kept crying, repeating the same words. Paul had never mentioned anyone named Lydia before. It wasn't his partner's name. It wasn't his child's name. I started jogging. As I ran, he got louder, desperate, begging for forgiveness. I shouted reassurance into the radio, telling him I was almost there, telling him we'd sort it out. I didn't know what I was saying. I was terrified. Paul was not someone who cried easily. Even as a kid, he hid pain at all costs. Hearing him like that filled me with dread. When I was only a few 100 meters from camp, I told him I was nearly there. Then he screamed. He shouted the name Lydia again and again. The sound distorted horribly. Then came a long electronic scream, drawn out, unnatural, and then complete silence. I ran. I sprinted back to camp, calling his name, heart hammering. When I arrived, Paul wasn't there. I searched the campsite. No response. I ran to the lock where we'd been fishing, still nothing. Then, from the trees to my left, Paul stepped out, carrying firewood. He looked completely normal, calm, slightly annoyed. He asked what I was shouting about. I stared at him, confused, convinced it had to be a prank. I asked him directly if this was a joke. He said no. He told me his radio had gone silent hours earlier and that he hadn't heard a single thing from me until I came running into camp. Once I calmed down, I told him exactly what I'd heard. He denied crying. Then I mentioned the name, Lydia. His expression changed. He asked if I'd gone through his phone, if I'd spoken to his girlfriend. I hadn't. Finally, he explained. Only 2 people knew what he was about to tell me. His girlfriend had found out she was pregnant just over a week earlier. They hadn't planned it, but they'd decided to keep the baby. They'd begun discussing names. If it was a boy, Paul liked the name Max. If it was a girl, they both agreed on Lydia. I felt sick. Months later, a baby girl was born. They named her Lydia. For years afterward, the memory stayed with me. The older she got, the less afraid I became. But even now, part of me still wonders whether I heard something that hadn't happened yet, or something that never should. And that thought is far more frightening than anything I heard through that radio.